I'll turn it over now. I'll shut up and turn it over to David, and he can share his screen. We'll listen to his talk. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks for that introduction, Adrian. And if anybody else was having trouble hearing the audio from the other session at the same time as I was, go to that other window and click on the volume icon down in the lower left. And then you won't have to try and listen to two of us speaking at the same time. So I was pleased to get this invitation to speak today about something that I've worked with for many years here at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. And here's what RMBL looks like. This is perhaps the most active field station in the world in terms of the numbers of people who come here, the number of pollination biologists who work here. We've had probably on the order of close to 100 researchers here over the years who have worked on pollination at RMBL, and on the neighborhood of about 300 publications that have come out. If any of you are interested in that, I have a bibliography I'd be happy to send, or a list of the researchers who've worked here over the years. So this is up at 9,500 feet, 8 miles outside Crested Butte, and I'm up here at the lab today, although it looks much browner than it does in this picture. One of the things that pollination biologists and pollinators have to pay attention to is the fact that the environment is changing so rapidly. We're seeing changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, increases in variability of some of these environmental variables. So that changing ecological environment is a challenge both for pollinators, their host plants, and for the researchers. The lower left graph here shows how much of the annual precipitation that we get here in Crested Butte at the weather station there falls as snow versus rain. And you can see that starting maybe around 1980, it looks like we may have reached a tipping point, and we're now starting to see more of our annual precipitation as rain instead of snow. And that's bad for a number of reasons, including making skiing more difficult, making agriculture more difficult because the water is not being stored in this reservoir of snowpack in the mountains the way it used to be, and also difficult for wildflowers. There's a graph on the lower right here showing the total snowfall in Gothic, and somewhat arbitrarily, I've broken it into these two time periods for which we have data. And it looks like, whereas for the first few decades of my work here, we were on a trend towards increasing snowpack with a lot of variation, we're now on a trend towards declining snowpack. That combination of lower snowpack, more dust storms than we used to see, warmer temperatures is leading to earlier snowmelt. So the left-hand graph shows what day of the year does snowmelt occur. And note once again that there's a lot of variation, but there's a pretty strong trend towards earlier snowmelt. And then on the right, one of the environmental variables responsible for this earlier snowmelt is the warming temperatures. And they're actually warming pretty dramatically in this part of southwest part of Colorado compared to other parts of North America. In 1973, a group of us started a project here collecting data on the phenology of flowering, phenology and abundance. And phenology refers to the seasonal timing of flowering or other natural events. And our technique was to set up 2 by 2 meter plots, go around to these plots in different habitats, and 3 times a week, count every flower of all the species that occurs in these plots. And that's turned out to be about 120 different species of plants. Most of them are herbaceous wildflowers. And we have now counted somewhere coming up close to 6 million flowers over the years in these counts. We have now close to 40 of these plots that we visit 3 times a week for the whole length of the growing season. So that's given us one of the most comprehensive records in the world of how is the timing of flowering and the abundance of flowering in the natural community changing. Here's one example for the first plant to bloom in these plots in the spring, sometimes even before the snow is completely melted in the plots. The spring beauty, or Claytonia lanceolata, sends up its buds, and you can see there's a very strong linear relationship between when they come into bloom and when the snow melts. So the day of year of bare ground is a very important date. It can be highly variable. It's ranged anywhere between the 24th of April to the, I think it's about the 19th of June. I can't quite see that last graph, that last data point, yeah, 19th of June. And so highly variable, but a very strong effect of when the snow melts on when things come into bloom. It turns out that many of these species have a similar kind of relationship with their floral abundance. The more snow we get, the more flowers they make. So given the NOAA forecast that this is going to be a pretty dry winter, I can already forecast that next summer is not going to be, well, A, will be early flowering, and B, not great flowering, unfortunately. Another species for which we have a lot of data is this tall bluebell, Martensia ciliata, pollinated mostly by bumblebees. And here I've plotted the number of flowers that we counted in these plots, the maximum number each year from 1973 up until almost the present. And note that in the late 90s, all of a sudden the numbers of flowers just fell off a cliff there. And I think what's happened is it's now too warm at this altitude, perhaps a combination of too warm and too dry for these tall bluebells. And they've disappeared from the lower altitudes around Crested Butte, as well as here up at Gothic at 9,500 feet now. So that seems to be true of some other species too that are moving up the mountains, or at least disappearing from their lower range. In addition to looking at individual species, we also keep track at the community level. And so here's a graph showing the number of flowers of all species broken into two time periods, one starting in 1974 and going up through 2002. That's in blue. And then in the red, the rust colored, is the data from 2003. And you can see that in the later years, the growing season is starting earlier, so the number of flowers starts earlier. It also runs later, and that upper left inset graph shows what's the length of the flowering season, and you can see that it's getting longer. But one worrisome event is that we see two peaks of flowering, an early peak and a later peak, and a low point in between. And as the flowering season is stretching out, that low point in the middle of the season is getting deeper, more pronounced. And that's the time of year when there are lots of baby hummingbirds that need to be fed, when there are lots of baby bumblebees that need to be fed. And so we're concerned about what's going to happen in the future to this low point in the middle of the flowering season. If you're looking at floral abundance, let's say this upper graph is the historical pattern. Each colored graph is a different species, and there's an early one, a mid-season one, a later season one, and the end of season. And one question is, what happens to that community pattern of flowering as climate changes? Do they all shift in concert, as would be true of that lower graph of this hypothesis, or as we're actually seeing, is it more like this in the lower graph here, that there's a unique response by each species? Some of them are changing their timing more strongly than others. Some of them are now have longer flowering periods than they used to. Some of them shorter. So we can't generalize and say, here is what a particular species is doing without collecting the data for each of those species. And it means that the whole community is changing. One example of a kind of change that seems to be an effect of climate change is the effect of frost on this sunflower. This is the Aspen Sunflower, although it's not growing in the aspen understory here in the shadow of Gothic Mountain, just outside the biological lab. And you can see how abundant this long-lived perennial sunflower can be in some years. And it's a very important resource, both for pollinators and also for insects like seed predators. The next picture shows the same meadow, the same time of year, but a different year. Where'd all the flowers go? Well, this plant is sensitive to frost, and in that particular year, all the buds got killed by frost. And as the snow melts earlier in the spring than it used to, that sets up the opportunity for a frost kill, because we're still getting hard frosts as late as about the 10th of June. And sometimes now the snow is melting in mid-April or late April, and that means that the plants have started growing, they have a month of growth on them, and then the frost hits. So one of the things I do a lot of is counting, and here's a graph showing the counts of the numbers of aspen sunflower heads that I've counted since 1974. And 2 points to make here. One is that there are a lot of zeros, and I think the zeros are becoming more common, and those are years in which there was frost damage. Another thing to point out is that it looks like there's cycles here. I think there are 3 cycles, and this points out the value of having long-term data. If I didn't have 30, 40 years of data, I wouldn't be able to pick up on these kinds of slow multi-year cycles that seem to be happening. So what are the consequences for pollinators of this kind of variation that we're seeing in flowering? One of the advantages of working at a field station is that there are lots of biologists here working on different things. And this story I'm going to tell now involves research on this butterfly, the fritillary butterfly, done by Dr. Carol Boggs from University of South Carolina. And she had a long-term data set, which she hadn't published because she couldn't figure out why were the butterfly populations so variable from one year to the next. And she happened to mention to me, well, these butterflies are very reliant on the nectar of this one species of erigeron, this fleabane daisy. The females are unusual in that the number of eggs they can make is limited by how much nectar they can collect. And this plant is frost sensitive. Here's a graph showing the number of flowers I counted, plotted against how much snow is there in late spring. And if there's not much snow, we end up with not many flowers because most of the buds get frosted, like in that upper left inset picture. And she was able to find that 84% of the variation in the butterfly population's growth rate is explained by what's the ratio of flowers per butterfly the year before. If there are not many flowers, the butterflies don't get enough nectar, they can't lay enough eggs, and the next year the population's down. And so that's pretty unusual for an insect population to be able to explain so much variation about its population. But here it's we're able to show that decreasing snowpack and warmer springs leads to earlier snowmelt. That increases the incidence of frost damage, and therefore there are fewer flowers and less nectar for the butterflies, and hence fewer butterflies. Hummingbirds are important pollinators here, the broad-tailed hummingbirds like the ones shown here. And they're changing when they first arrive. They're changing their arrival phenology when they migrate here. But they're not changing that rate they're not changing at the same rate as the first flowers that they visit. The glacial lilies here, Erythronium grandiflorum. If those 2 lines were parallel, they'd be changing at the same rate in responding to snowpack. So this is one example of the kind of phenological mismatch between pollinators and flowers that we're predicting is going to occur because of climate change. We know that bumblebees are moving up in altitude. We did a survey in 1974, repeated it in 2007. We were hoping to repeat it this summer, but we didn't have enough research assistants because of the COVID crisis. Maybe we'll get it done again next summer. But queens of the bumblebees, of 8 bumblebee species, have moved up 230 meters in that interval. We also have started putting together data on the interaction between the environment, looking at a combination of precipitation and snowmelt date, how that affects how many days flowers are available and how many flowers are available, and how that affects, in this case, 3 different bumblebee species. And it turns out these variables do affect almost all of these species. At least 2 of the 3 are affected by both of these environmental variables, but not in the same way, which means that we can't even generalize within bumblebees and say, well, here's how bumblebees are responding to climate change. You really have to look at individual species. And we're doing the same sort of analysis for bumblebees, for solitary bees, flies, butterflies, and hummingbirds, and looking at how do poor floral abundance days affect them. And almost all these species, except for hummingbirds, are being affected by poor floral abundance days. And snowmelt date has the biggest effect on those poor floral abundance days. And that perhaps makes sense since I already told you that there's a strong relationship between how much snow we get and how many flowers there are, and that snowpack is declining. So these floral resource metrics are changing divergently for different pollinator species, which means we really have to keep track of individual species. Let me tell you a little bit about one wildflower. This is Delphinium Natalyanum, the early larkspur, which is If you pull the flower apart, you can see the nectar chamber back here where the pollinators have to reach the nectar. And it's pollinated in part by long-tongued bumblebees. Here's her long tongue. And here's pollen that she's collected from these larkspur flowers, and also by the broad-tailed hummingbirds. The numbers of those flowers changes pretty dramatically from year to year. And here's a graph of some plots that I've kept track of for the last 30 years. And if you plot what's the maximum number either of flowers, which is the upper line, or the number of flowering plants that bore those flowers, which is the lower line, there is a pretty strong relationship between both of those and how much snow we get. The more snow, the more plants come up and make flowers, and the more flowers they make. So the fact that we can predict declining snowpack in the future is not good news for this larkspur or the pollinators that depend on it. In this meadow over here, right next to the biological lab, we've had a project running since 1984, keeping track of the insect populations. So Dave Goulson this morning told you about Malaise traps, and we put a Malaise trap out for 2 days a week for most of the growing season. And we know that in that meadow, there's no problem with pesticides, that habitat's not changing, there are no artificial lights. And so we're thinking that this decline that we're seeing, even in this undisturbed area, is a significant decline in insect populations, must be related to climate change. At least we haven't come up with other explanations yet. And we have a paper that's in review now about those results, but that's somewhat depressing, not only about pollinators, but insects in general. In addition to the 3 times a week counts that we're doing of wildflowers, we're now also doing a biweekly census of bees at 3 different elevations. And we know now that we have about 140 species of bees of the 1,000 or so that occur here in Colorado. We have 12 years of data. We're keeping track of the bee phenology. And here's some data on when we see these different species of solitary bees during the summer. And now we're looking at the effects of climate, floral resources, and nesting habitat on all of these 140 species of bees. And this data set is, again, one of the most comprehensive that we have about bee communities, and will be part of the new national monitoring plan that is just being set up to monitor native bees here in North America, in the United States. And I'm part of that effort, as another RMBL researcher here. So we know the climate is changing, that snowmelt dates are getting earlier, flowering is starting earlier. There seems to be more frost damage, pollinators are being affected, and this variation in how different species are responding is going to lead to altered and new pollinator interactions. So these wonderful wildflower meadows that we have here around Gothic, we're beginning to understand in some detail now the biology of these individual wildflowers, and then also of some of their pollinators. There is some concern that as the climate gets warmer and drier, that at these altitudes, we're going to see more and more sagebrush, as is shown in this picture at the foot of Crested Butte Mountain, just outside Crested Butte, and fewer of these wildflowers. And that's not good news for those of us that like wildflowers or pollinators. It may be that in 50 years, there's going to be the Crested Butte Sagebrush Festival instead of the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival, which we have now. I've spent 50 summers here at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. The Social Security Administration estimates I'm going to live 15 more years. I'm hoping to get 15 more data points for all of these projects. But I've been fortunate to enlist my son and his wife, both of whom are ecologists and are now working here at RMBL2. So hopefully I may have a second generation of people collecting these data about pollinators and their resources. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions later on.
Man, thanks so much, David. That was just such a great example of so much amazing natural history information. I'm sure everybody who just saw that talk is blown away just by the wealth of information that's there at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And great to know that there's such dedicated people there studying these kinds of environmental changes that are driving both plant and pollinator responses there. I'm sure we're going to get a whole bunch of questions from folks. I think maybe what we'll do is just move on for speakers, and then y'all are going to have the opportunity as speakers to join the tables to interact. And so if you've got more questions there, we can entertain some of those. So I got one good question though that just popped up. I'm going to ask you: are there honeybees in Gothic?
No. I think, I'm not sure I'm muted, but no, there are not. We're fortunate at this altitude, we do not have honeybees, just those 140 or so species of native bees.
Awesome. Yeah, I have to admit, I've only been there a couple of times, but was blown away by just how abundant the wild bees were there. And I often wondered whether or not it might have something to do with whether or not honeybees were there. So it'd be really cool to find out.